just to thank the presenters again, and to let the participants know to please post your questions in the chat box and in the Q&A box. Before we do that, Tim, just to give you an opportunity to elaborate on things that may have missed, or just quick overview of things that may have missed during the slide transitions.
Yeah, I apologize for some of those, a few choppy transitions there as I was going through the recording. Nothing was really missed. I think we really were able to convey most of the key ideas. Hopefully everybody was able to follow there. In the one slide about the shared kitchen space, working with folks from the food corridor, it's a national network of certified kitchens. What I was trying to convey in that slide is just the big growth, as you probably doesn't surprise people during this period of interest in local food. How do we get this work locally? A lot of growth in the farm market space, a lot of local vendors looking to move into these kinds of certified kitchen spaces, and a big surge in demand for that kind of infrastructure, surge in demand for that kind of technical assistance. And while on one hand, a great market opportunity that I think will continue going forward, we just have power surges, if you will, in all kinds of different aspects of the local food system that have just created a lot of challenges. I'm sure you see it across some of your communities there in California as well, but really a national issue.
Thanks, Tim. Catherine, questions? Don't want to dominate the conversation. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question, a general question for the panelists. So there have been a lot of shifts with COVID that you have all highlighted that have kind of prepared us for some of the big shifts we might expect with extreme weather events due to climate and adaptation. And I wondered and you highlight some of those shifts, if you could pinpoint which of those we need to focus on growing, and which of those might just be for COVID and maybe not as applicable for some of the disruptions we'll see with climate.
I can start maybe a little bit. I really appreciated Christy's observations about the challenges with particularly nutrition and access difficulties. And we've certainly seen that in the COVID space. We see that as it's playing out in some of the climate disruptions that are playing out there as well. And I think it certainly falls to all of us as a community of citizens. How do we look at a resilient system that is going to provide the nutrition needs and the quality of food access to underserved parts of our populations, the vulnerable parts of our population? And I think this COVID disruption has really brought that front and center and just shown us how fragile some of that system is. You think about in the farm to school programs, and that's not just the local farm products to local schools thing. It's all of our feeding programs in schools generally. When all of a sudden kids are at home, where do they look to for food, nutrition? How is that managed? What is our plan B? It's a pretty fragile system.
And I'd like to take Tim's excellent comments forward a little bit more, in that the choices made today under the recovery are going to affect us for decades to come. Lots of money is being spent, lots of money will be spent, and how are we going to spend that? And how can we, as a collection of citizens, as you said, help inform the decision makers about some priorities that will set the stage for what we're going to see over the next several years. If we don't increase the resilience for the most vulnerable, then we know what the consequences are going to be with more extreme weather events. That's fairly straightforward. How can we make sure that this resilience is built into the stimulus funding, so that these are choices that when we look back, we're glad we made.
Our region.
Trish, I think you're muted.
Oh, I've unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're a little faint, but yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. One of the things that we've talked about is how the innovations that are happening with the pivot will become innovations that we can build upon. What can we learn from what we're doing now that is actually creating more efficiencies in the system? Because we know we're not going to go back to what was. So one thing that's happened is some new partnerships with groups like UC Davis Health and our school district. We've been in a network together, but now there's talk about joint purchasing. The school district's been working with the food banks for joint distribution sites to reach families. Like you mentioned, Christy, how do you reach students and others in need? So we are using this opportunity to see what we can learn about gaining efficiency. So part of this in relating to the institutional procurement is that, for instance, Sac City Unified School District just was supposed to open a central kitchen, but they purchase from local growers, and they are working to get food waivers from USDA so they can use cash in lieu of commodities. That's a practical change where we don't have to go into the USDA commodities, we can purchase locally. But what if we joint purchase with UC Davis? Then we have more market power, we have food system aggregation, we work with our food distributors, so we can then be supporting our local growers. And that is something that our grocery stores have told us, especially Raley's and Nugget. One reason they didn't have as many supply chain gaps in the, after COVID is because they had more networks with local farmers and ranchers and food distributors and manufacturers too. So it's the value added part. So I think that there are opportunities definitely there. And Christy, I really appreciate what you said about informing the responses, the federal responses to COVID.
And to add to that as well, there are so many initiatives locally, and thinking of opportunities to join them up. I was impressed several years ago reading about an initiative in Mexico City that's got a huge problem with trash. And so they've got a place to go to take your recycling. And people then get vouchers for bringing recycling, and the farmer's market is right there. And they can use the vouchers in the farmer's market to get access to better quality food than they would in their neighborhoods. And to think as broadly as we can about the excellent work that is being done and how to promote it as broadly as we can.
Yeah, and I was just gonna, before we jump into some of the questions that are in the Q&A, I was just going to add to that. There are so many activities that are happening at the local level that do need to be broadcast and amplified, because with COVID, of course, this is what is on everybody's mind, and we've been thrown into this scenario that we've all had to adjust and adapt fairly quickly. But it is likely that we'll have many emerging scenarios that might throw us into a similar, challenge that we will either globally or on larger national, international levels have to respond to quickly, and also have to share information. So I would be interested to know, in a similar way, what type of either federal or international or even state, interstate programs are available to start sharing information, so that when the next challenge arises, we are more adept at sharing that information, so that we can be more efficient in how we respond, so that we're not spinning wheels and maybe reinventing responses, because it is important that we learn from our experiences. So these are all wonderful points. I think we have some questions that I'm just going to respond to or put out there to the group. So one comes from Roger. Generally speaking, the public, including farmers, only recognize that the climate impacts of temperature, precipitation, and storms, but not nutritional impacts change the quality of air. Is that generally the impression?
I can't answer for farmers, but I really like some of the points that you brought up. So if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to those for a moment.
Sure.
Two things that came up in your comments. One is I live in King County, and I honestly don't know how this happened, but every 2 years, King County partners with one of our major media outlets and gives Green Globe Awards for sustainability. And they are just fabulous efforts. And to think about how locally to establish something like that, because it raises awareness of the great work that's going on. Work a lot with students who get very concerned about what's happening with climate change. And you can point out, here's 50 different NGOs where you can go make a difference locally. But that also gets publicity that then gets picked up more broadly. And so you can, that's one fora for celebrating what is being done, getting greater engagement with the quality work that is being done and making it more public. The other opportunity in terms of lessons learned and sharing is, of course, the National Climate Assessment. And the United States Global Change Research Program is aiming for the 5th National Climate Assessment. There's a call right now for authors, for people who want to put their names forward. But in the process of conducting the assessment, historically, there's been regional workshops where people bring forward issues that could be put into the national assessment. There usually are chapters on adaptation where you can bring forward some of the things that you've learned to share with others. There are also now regional chapters, and the regional chapters have been very powerful in doing that. So that is one specific way to bring this information forward nationally.
Yeah, I would also add there are some clearinghouses too, like online tools that you can add case studies.
Yeah.
Trish?
Governments
I'm mute
has-
again.
You know, I'm not on mute. I guess I have to just lean closer. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. The Sacramento Area Council of Governments has done a lot of work through this toolkit called Rural Urban Connection Strategy. And they've done some partnering, of course, with UC Davis on that. And one thing they've shown is that the climate change, the climate emissions from land in agricultural production versus other kinds of land use. And so it's really informed our regional planning efforts to make sure that we do ag land preservation and conservation, minimize ag land conversion, and grow in a more compact and sustainable way. So even there are emissions from ag activities, our land use overall affects and helps us meet our climate change goals that we have, our greenhouse gas emissions targets that the regional planning agencies have to meet. And then I think the other thing we've been talking about the use of technologies to reduce energy and water use, for instance, can help reduce emissions too. And then there's the facilities, like I know some farmers are switching to solar on fields or for different kind of operations. I know there's a lot of research going on campus about those kind of activities. But I think the other area for health is looking at, there's a lot of work around soil health as well.
I'm just going through, Andrea posted something in the chat box. Can the panelists speak a bit about the efforts in schools? Chris, Tim, and Trish mentioned schooling, kind of young people in general. What are some efforts that go into kind of educating children kind of about health, nutrition, but also kind of different kinds of risks that are emerging?
I'm not an expert on K through 12. I can certainly speak more to what's going on at universities. Mm-hmm. I know that there's efforts in the K through 12 through some programs through the federal agencies to think about more training materials on climate change, accurate training materials. But as you undoubtedly know, in K through 12, it's kind of up to the school districts to decide what they're covering and what they're not. And that's been a perpetual problem. solution is above my pay grade. Tim's nodding his head. Tim?
Oh, totally. I totally feel it. I have seen some really creative things. I know we've got a program even here in Lexington, Kentucky, where we're at, where the whole county-wide system of schools shares a sustainability coordinator for middle school programs. Super program. And they teach the students about everything from recycling and water, and issues about even the local food stuff, and the farm to school program gets integrated into this whole program. They have poster contests that the kids do, and they make a really big program out of it. But this sort of a shared instructor across the schools is a creative way. And I think we're going to see here again with our crazy COVID disruption and how we're doing education, more of this kind of innovative supplemental education beyond and delivery beyond what's kind of traditionally in the classroom space going forward. And I think those issues of how we bring these topics of sustainability and communities and sort of individual responsibility, community responsibility to kids at a young age, it's a super point in time, I think, for us to be creative in that space.
Yeah, we have some nonprofits in addition that are working on those issues. We have the Center for Land-Based Learning nearby in Woodland, and they actually work across the state. And they do a lot of different things they have a farm academy and an apprenticeship program to train people to be working in farms, and as farm managers, they help manage an urban ag program for one of our cities, but they also have a program that really specifically targets K through 12 on environmental stewardship. So they look at the working farms as kind of real practical ways where the kids can go out in the field and see how you can manage a resource sustainably. So that's a really great. Yolo County, where it's located, is a big ag county, so the kids can really see it all around themselves and how they can do it, adapt environmental practices. And I think the other way that nonprofits are helping is exposing children to where their food comes from, food literacy, food nutrition, and organic ag and things like that. So we have some urban farms that are really helping get the kids more aware of what ag looks like in the region.
So I'm just going back over the Q&As. We have a question from Sam here about how non-ag folks can make ourselves of use in the sector. What are different entry points for average citizen involvement? I know Kristen and Catherine, you talked a little bit about kind of the different partnerships, and Trish, you did too. What are some kind of ways that maybe young people or people who are not typically part of this field, what are the sorts of entry points for inclusion and for diverse voices and for representation of interests that we may typically not kind of come across in the dominant conversations that's going on? Trish.
Well, first off, I always say buy local. That's a big thing. We're the farm to fork capital of the country, and we have farmers markets, and we've seen an increase in community supported agriculture as a lot of people have pivoted more to direct purchasing from farmers. But I think that that's a really important question. We have a network of nonprofits in both our urban and rural communities that are trying to have community-led approaches to strengthening food systems and helping people get access to healthier food. And they are engagement opportunities for volunteering and supporting community-led efforts. We have had a discussion with the city about building in planning projects that really more intentionally look at food access, because we have a lot of food deserts that we have documented. So I think being aware and finding out where your resources are to connect with local partners, supporting them, even if it's even if you don't do anything more than on Big Day of Giving, contribute to the nonprofits that are working to improve food resiliency would be really valuable.
And Tim, I'm just reminded of the different networks that you're working with. Are there particular kind of ways or kind of experiences with engaging with kind of minority communities or Native American communities in the kinds of work that you're trying to do? Are there differences? Are there ways to kind of empower more those kinds of more diverse communities?
Yeah, it's an enormous question, and it's something we've tried to weave in very intentionally throughout our whole program. I think there are ways in which, whether you're talking about farm to school, farm to restaurant, and the kind of farmer supplier aspect of those underserved and sometimes marginalized producer groups, how are those folks being impacted in these spaces? And are they carrying proportionally larger weight of burden as this disruption hits? We see that in some cases for sure. And in kind of parallel to that, many of the communities that have been really innovative around local sourcing programs that are also either ethnically or economically challenged communities also have been adversely impacted disproportionately to some other parts of the country. And so, you know, thinking about how we, it's really forced us, I think, as we've had listening sessions across these different networks, to intentionally ask those kinds of questions. It's forced people to kind of look at those issues where they hadn't really had to before. And, you know, it's even in terms of just sort of the makeup and the participation and the kind of market targets that have been out there traditionally with a lot of the local food spaces. The local food community can be sometimes accused as being, in some cases, come off as this kind of elitist, high-end consumer, people that can only afford to eat that way, make those kinds of choices. Do we need to be rethinking the whole area of especially access and low-income access? How do we get innovative in those spaces? And can we find ways to make things work both for our low-income and disadvantaged citizens and for our local farmers at the same time? And surely we can, and we surely have seen that happen with SNAP programs that are being applied in unique ways, food assistance programs that are being developed in kind of innovative ways, even CSA programs that develop clever ways to have low-income access programs as part of those become sort of woven into the value of that community-supported agriculture fabric. So I think there's a lot we can do. There's a lot more we need to do. And I think this whole disruption is kind of forcing people across this system to lean in and listen and observe and try to better understand how do we do that and what's the role of the local food system in that.
Tim, if I could ask a follow-up question, because this is something that's been bothering me quite a lot. State of Washington, like the entire West Coast, has had massive wildfires. Our supermarkets are flooded with apples at super cheap prices because, you know, they had to get them picked before, a couple of years ago, before they were cooked into applesauce on the trees. And I stood there thinking, I would pay full price for these. Yep. And as a consumer, I stood there and thought, I don't know how to pay full price for these. I don't know how to say I'm willing to pay what I should pay. And I understand that the farmers are facing these very difficult challenges with the wildfires, with all the smoke we're getting from California. And I'm really sorry what's going on in California.
Yeah.
And so it is a very complicated cycle. And as a consumer, there's often limited ways for us to try and do anything other than say, yes, I'm willing to go to a farmer's market and buy from the farmer, although it's more challenging with COVID.
Yeah, no easy answers around that one. I'm sure if you found a farmer that was to whom you were willing to pay a little bit of extra money, they would find a way to take it. But the thing we haven't really talked about very much is even just how the logistics and supply chain systems have been disrupted in all of this, and even just some of the basic logistics of getting trucking a product from California to the East Coast or to some of the other urban centers around the United States. At the time where things were peaking in New York, truckers didn't want to go into the city, and who could blame them? For just the personal risks that they were being subjected to. Not an easy situation, and again, that just seemed to come back and amplify some of the need for at least redundant supplemental local sourcing systems that could be put in place that could be some kind of a fallback, so that we weren't as dependent on really remote food sources.
Yeah, and that is a really good point, because there's so much emphasis, particularly from industry, in focusing on efficiency. And we're seeing that problem right now.
Right.
It was very efficient when everything worked.
Right.
And there was almost no redundancy, because that's not efficient. And how to find that balance, how to educate, you need that redundancy, and then how to find a way to balance that.
That's one reason why we focus a lot on building what we're calling food system infrastructure. So, we have a good temperate climate here for growing, and we can grow almost year round, but we are looking at new business models like indoor ag or vertical farming, because that gives us more redundancy and options and new opportunities for new business. We're looking at urban ag, not just community gardens, but urban ag as enterprise development that can help create some food access in maybe food desert areas, but help with community revitalization. But the other part is food hubs. We have a lot of really great food distribution companies, but we've done some work on looking at food hubs that add value, like maybe they can prepare food for schools, that next level of processing that would also help smaller farmers with food aggregation, food safety certification and all those things that would help smaller growers connect into larger markets like the institutional procurement. That's kind of the missing piece, I think, in our infrastructure here that would really help connect more farmers to local sources of supply. And that would provide more resiliency or redundancy. I did want to say that the fires were pretty close to here, and the smoke was terrible, as everybody in this region knows, for over a month. Horrible air quality. And a lot of the local farmers said it didn't only affect their crops, but the photosynthesis process. So what's coming for the next cycle of crops. So, it's really daunting, but we have hope.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Because there often tends to be this tension between localization versus a more streamlined, centralized system, which is vulnerable to breaks. And some places like the Central Valley in California can localize and eat very well. But other places are dependent on food supply from very, very far away. So I know this is a big conversation in economics, I'll let Tim characterize how that conversation is playing out, because it seems to me that there's more folks on one side versus the other in the localization versus streamline. But it also seems like we're now having conversations, as Trish is pointing out, Raley's and Nugget and other markets that have more regional localized supply have less disruption. So there are benefits. And then, as Christy pointed out, if you don't live in a part of the world where you can localize very easily and you don't have purchasing power, things are looking pretty scary. So I wondered if maybe we could start with Christy from the global food equity side, and then Tim can tell us where ag economists are falling in their thinking from the global, national, and then and Trish can tell us what's happening locally on that.
It's a good question, and you posed an important question, and you did provide most of the answer of this is very complicated, and that the decisions have to be taken across scales. That within a food system, none of us are any longer independent of each other. Well, there's a few people who can grow their own food and consume it, but even in very rural parts of Africa, there still is a food system where people go out, even if it's trade, to go out and trade with other villages to get other critical elements of their diet. And it is thinking through, from the perspective of the SDGs, how we can help facilitate across the sectors, across the regions, and across this local to national to international scales. There are multiple examples where there is work to try and facilitate, for example, resilience at the local level in Africa, where within the context of a changing climate, there are some test communities where the farmers make an agreement that they will try to plant different crops because you don't know which ones are going to do well and which ones are going to fail when you have high uncertainty about your weather patterns. And then the ones that do well share their yield with the farmers that did poorly because they didn't have the right combination to plant. And so thinking in a more collective response of how to ensure the food security that is so important to hundreds of millions of people. Tim?
Yeah, I mean, it's an enormous question. You know, you talk to a company like Nestle that is sourcing through very complex supply chains, coffee, cocoa, dairy products from all over the globe. And you see their big map of their supply chain and how they're having to try to manage their costs, their risks, at the same time as they're trying to move towards sustainability in these supply chains. And a big part of the sustainability conversation for a company like Nestle, a truly global sourcing entity, pivots around these: what are we doing for the local communities, and are the local communities able to continue to be healthy, vibrant, the sustainable agricultural practices there that, from the point of view of Nestle, I'm just sort of using them as an example here, all these big global folks face the same challenges. They need those supply chains to be resilient and to be in place for the long run. And I think when you even look at our food system in the United States, we need, as food consumers in the United States, to have strong supply chains that also are going to be resilient. Not everybody can grow pineapples or citrus or pistachios or almonds. Different parts of the country have comparative advantage in producing that. And that's the argument the ag economists would say, focus on comparative advantage. But I think what has been introduced in this new era of disruption is understanding the risk of just a pure short-term thinking market economy that just depends on larger and larger scale, more and more focused, whether it's fruits and vegetables, whether it's meat processing, whatever those dairy products, whatever those might be. All of a sudden we find that we have the proverbial all our eggs in one basket problem. And when the basket gets dropped, we're all in trouble. And so there's different ways that now that I think people are recognizing, thoughtful economists are recognizing, we need to understand the value of redundant systems that are going to be part of a larger way of how we frame resiliency, food security, access, especially vulnerable parts of our population. All those things need to be brought to the table.
Thanks.
Well,
Trish,
and I was,
well,
yeah, thank you. And I would say that's one reason we want to update our food system action plan. Again, to pull the pieces together and have a strategy, have a roadmap. I think I look at things too. I've seen shifts in doing this work over the years in the market demand, which creates new opportunities because this hyper system that was created for supply chains and so-called efficiencies, the paradigm has shifted. So there are new market opportunities and new imperatives now with climate change and the need for resiliency. So I think all the things have converged to create new opportunities. One thing that really is happening across the country, for instance, is repurposing old industrial buildings or other kind of spaces into these new food businesses like urban or vertical farming or indoor farming. EDA, the Economic Development Administration, and USDA have funded a lot of projects. There's a really great resource too from the Council for Development Financing Agencies that talks about treating food economy projects as an asset class that you should invest in, which has all kinds of projects: food hub, food grocery stores, food markets, and they're critical because they're revitalization activities too, and they help regenerate old neighborhoods, or they're part of a community's economic development strategy. But I think if you look at things like coop houses and greenhouses, ways that we build the infrastructure back so that we can produce food more year round. And then the other thing I'll say is like our food bank here in Yolo County, they have a process where they get a lot of produce in the summer. Now they have processing capabilities so that they can make food, so tomatoes. So you store roast tomatoes, whatever, you can create them for meals in the winter. So how do we take our abundance in the summer, process it through that capability, and then we have more year-round nutritious food? So there's a lot of strategies, and I think we can look to some of the federal funding sources to help us with those.
Great, thanks. I appreciate that we're over time. Thank you for the enthusiasm and for the really lively discussion, but I think for the sake of time, we must close. And thank you again, everybody, Tim, Chris, and Trish for joining us today, and Catherine for helping out and for co-organizing this. Looking forward to continuing this conversation however possible, but thank you again. And I think we would have to close.